thank all of you on a beautiful Sunday afternoon for coming here to be with us for an educational and, I have no doubt, inspiring event. A couple of logistical announcements. If you have not yet registered for this event, if your name wasn't part of an email distribution or you didn't sign up, would you please make sure that at the table at the front of the room, you get the Marin Housing Solutions website address and you register for this event. You'll be able to get the follow-up from this. You'll be able to get additional information from Marin Housing Solutions. So we'd like you to do that, please. The event is being videotaped. We have the cameras in the back of the room, so know that we will have a record of this event and the participation that we have today, and the information will be able, therefore, to be shared after this event. Now, finally, we do have live Spanish simultaneous translation, and Claudia here and the headsets there are available for anyone who would like to listen in Spanish. The Spanish is not part of the video recording. That will be in English. But if you do have a need or know somebody who has a need in Spanish, please let them know that we have that service available. Before we start, and I turn it over to Cesar to introduce the panelists, and I'll give him a quick introduction as well, I just want to say that there's nothing more important truly in Marin County than housing. We all know the challenges where, in this county in particular, over the past 4 years, the cost of housing has increased 48%. It makes it incredibly difficult for families to find those pathways to self-sufficiency. And what we have an opportunity today to do is learn more about what fair housing means in this county for individuals, for families, to be able to live in communities and have access to city services and good schools and good jobs without regard to their race, their ethnicity, or any other distinctions. So I'd like to turn it over to Cesar Lagleva, who is a member of United Marin Rising. And United Marin Rising is a grassroots coalition of community organizers and activists that is working towards social, environmental, and economic justice. Cesar.
Thank you. Before we begin, I'd like to also now introduce our panel members here, our distinguished panel members, not necessarily in order, but I'd like to first introduce Jessica Traunstein, who is a professor of political science at the University of California, Merced. She studies local politics in the United States in both historical and contemporary context. Traunstein's work is focused on understanding the process and quality of representation. She is the author of Political Monopolies in American Cities, The Rise and Fall of Bosses and Reformers, and Segregation by Design, Local Politics and Inequality in American Cities, as well as numerous articles. Next person that we have is Alicia Klein. Alicia Klein joined Resources for Community Development in 2012 and has 25 years of experience in affordable housing and development and funding. Her focus as Associate Director of Housing Development includes site acquisition, securing development funding, completing all site entitlements, and community outreach. Currently, Alicia is leading the housing development teams on new construction of affordable communities for low-income families, seniors, residents with special needs, and previously homeless individuals in Berkeley, Concord, and Oakland. Alicia was the lead in partnering with 2 churches to bring 2 new construction projects through pre-development and into construction. To carry out the vision of Christ Lutheran Church of Fairfax, she secured grant funds, commitments of county funding and rental subsidy, and hard-won local approvals of RCD's first development in Marin County, Victory Village for very low-income seniors. She collaborated with St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Walnut Creek to create affordable, supportive housing over a new homeless day center on church's land. Alicia has worked closely with church members to negotiate site control agreements, secure full funding commitments, and provide a temporary home for the day center. Alicia's previous experience includes senior-level project management and program management with the Richmond, California Community Redevelopment Agency and the San Francisco Mayor's Office of Housing, where she wrote the city's 2002 analysis of impediments to fair housing. to fair housing choice. Alicia got her start in affordable housing as a founding board member of faith-based transitional home for formerly homeless women recovering from substance use. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce to you Megan Kirkeby, who is the Assistant Director for Fair Housing with the California Department of Housing and Community Development's Housing Policy Division. She oversees the state's role in the regional housing needs assessment and fair housing initiatives. Prior to joining HCD, Megan has served as the policy director of the California Housing Partnership, a state-created nonprofit working on housing sustainability and preservation issues, policy associate for the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California, and intern with Policy Link as a community equity intern, analyzing infrastructure disparities in low-income unincorporated communities of color. So please give you a round of applause to our moderators. Okay, so we have a pretty great lineup here, as you can tell from their bios. Before we begin, and I would just like to inform the audience and our panel members that there is a format to this process and to our time together just to keep things more efficient and moving along. So what I'd like to do is just sort of give you a basic synopsis or a format of what you can expect this afternoon, one of which will first be to the presenters. You will have 15 minutes to make your opening remarks. After your panel member presentations, I will begin by asking 2 to 3 general questions to all panel members to answer in a Socratic dialogue format. And then in turn, the audience will also have an opportunity to ask direct questions or share your comments during an open mic session. A microphone will go around when hands are raised by the audience members after the presentations are over. And a few more ground rules and format information. For the audience, please keep your questions or comment to no more than 1 minute. Panel members, I will also request that you limit your response to a question to no more than 2 minutes. And I think last but not least, this issue, this topic, and this conversation may generate disagreements, and I would like to enforce and have us agree that disagreements are okay, that it's okay to disagree. So if we can agree to disagree this afternoon, I think we'll be in good shape leading up to the Warriors game. Okay, all right, so let's begin. I would like to first offer Jessica Traunstein an opportunity to present.
Oh, sure. If I use this one or not. Okay, I'm just gonna make sure. Is it on? Okay, I talk pretty loud anyway, but. Okay, thank you all for being here today. It's a really important conversation to be having, and I'm excited. Academics don't usually get to engage with either actual people in the real world or policy experts, so it's wonderful to be here. So I'm going to start by telling you mostly about my research. We all know that the quality of public goods in the United States is highly variable. Some people have access to good schools, well-paved and plowed roads, sewers that rarely overflow, public parks with playgrounds and restrooms, adequately staffed police and fire forces, and clean water, while other people do not. So why are some communities so well-resourced and others not? The answer, it turns out, is segregation. Segregation refers to the concentration of poor people and people of color in residential locations apart from wealthy and white residents. And I find in my work that it is segregation shaped by local political processes that permits unequal access to public goods and services. Despite many demographic and economic transformations, the United States remains a profoundly segregated nation. We can take a look at any metro area in the United States and ask, why are the schools so bad, crime rates so high, and the parks so dilapidated in a place like Richmond? While Mill Valley is a different world. Is it racism? Is it economic inequality? Well, the answer is not that simple. Since the earliest days of the United States urban development, local governments have played a role in influencing property values and have strategically allocated city services to benefit their core constituents. Take a guess at who those core constituents have been, historically speaking. White, property owners. Local politics is, at its core, the politics of land use, dominated by white property owners who have sought to enhance their wealth and control the allocation of services like public education. Since cities became modern service providers in the early 1900s, they have inequitably distributed services in a way that has entrenched segregation. Over time, as cities started to build sewage systems and water treatment plants, began to collect garbage and light streets, for the first time, they began to manipulate and direct uses of land as well. They planned and zoned land within city limits to define where certain types of housing and buildings could be located, or not. They also decided where public amenities and nuisances would be placed, where those parks would go, or where the garbage dump would go. As all of this unfolded, city governments sought to protect a single set of constituents, white homeowner neighborhoods and businesses, and they sought to protect them from integration. And they concentrated the delivery of public goods and public benefits on these politically powerful constituents. These strategies, a long, long time ago, resulted in persistent neighborhood-level residential segregation and inequalities in the delivery of municipal services. But this isn't just history. All of these patterns that got created 100 years ago persist, and they've been exacerbated as we have seen demographic transformation. Later, when the federal government offered funds for urban renewal and public housing, cities also utilized these same processes to reinforce earlier patterns, and we can see this again and again over time. It is important to understand that land development is not a free market process. In fact, it really hasn't been for 140 years. It has become ever more regulated over time, though. For more than 100 years, this process has benefited white constituents, property owners, and their allies, and disadvantaged people of color and those at the economic margins. After entrenching this subdivided landscape, white property owners became free to claim that segregation was simply the result of differences in individual preferences, or to argue that it was their right to protect their neighborhood, their right to send their children to good schools, and not a problem for them to deal with that other people didn't have access to these benefits. They decried governmental attempts to desegregate neighborhoods and spread public goods as infringements upon their rights. But I find also that where people of color have had political voice, segregation and inequality have been reduced, and that's the first key to understanding what has to change. In the decades following World War II, the political voices of the marginalized grew louder. As people of color contested municipal elections, demanded an end to Jim Crow, and the federal government took action against segregation, the control of many white property owners began to feel increasingly uncertain. And it is then that they moved to the suburbs, where they could maintain political power and police the borders of their communities more easily. As a result, segregation has changed form dramatically over time. We used to be segregated block by block. One block would have been Irish, and the next block might have been African American. That changed, so that we became segregated neighborhood by neighborhood, and now, today, we're segregated city by city. As a result, this metropolitan segregation has changed form and scale, and during every attempt by higher-level governments to desegregate what's on the ground, we have seen a change, a new form of segregation emerge. So how do fair housing laws play a role here? Well, the idea is that these laws at the state or federal level, and we can talk about different levels of government here, will compel cities to generate opportunities for integration by changing their land use regulations, encouraging the building of diverse housing, and preventing discrimination in the housing market. In other work, I show that suing cities under the Fair Housing Act works. It does, in fact, generate more race and class diversity. But unfortunately, simply having the law on the books doesn't do much. Why? Because communities are very good at avoiding things that they don't like. Integration requires sustained action, and importantly, making sure that marginalized communities have a seat at the table. Otherwise, all we do is displace people again and again and again. I have some new work looking at the features of development that inspire the most opposition from different segments of the population. So this is not published, so I'll just sort of speak broadly about my findings. But what I find is that homeowners care a great deal about maintaining their property values. Wealthy residents tend to oppose affordable housing in their neighborhood in order to prevent redistribution of their taxes. And that white residents are the most powerful objectors to developments that have large populations of people of color. The respondents in my 1,000-person survey nationwide believe that people of color and low-income residents will decrease the quality of their schools, increase the rate of crime, and lower their property values. These are powerful beliefs that are hard to overcome, but we must try. We must figure out how to house all people of all income levels and all racial backgrounds.
Thank you. Fantastic. Off to a great start. The next person I'd like to invite to speak and present is Alicia Klein.
Okay. Thank you, Cesar. Can folks hear me? Okay? Okay. I want to take you back to a late night 2 years ago. It's halfway through a public hearing in the town of Fairfax, about halfway through an hour or so of public comment on the Victory Village development for low-income seniors. And during public comment, a member of the town of Fairfax Historical Society shared an interesting artifact that he had found. It was marketing materials for a new neighborhood in Fairfax from the early 1900s. And on this document, among the wonderful qualities of the new neighborhood were, of course, the natural beauty of the setting, very good schools, and that in this new neighborhood there would be no, quote, Jews, Negroes, or Orientals, unquote. Mic drop. That jarring statement drove home for me the importance of the evolving fair housing strategies on 3 levels. At its most basic level, we've evolved as a society, thank goodness, since the early 1900s, to agree that determining where people can live based on race and other protected classes and characteristics is illegal. At the second level, we need to work proactively to overcome the legacy of institutional racism, like that example, by doing broad marketing and making sure any preferences don't hurt protected classes. And then on a third level, one of the most powerful ways to advance fair housing choice, and especially in the Bay Area and especially in high resource areas like Marin County, is to create new affordable housing and truly a new housing at every affordability level for low-income residents and families and individuals while preserving existing affordable housing and protecting renters and homeowners from displacement pressure and possibly losing their homes. You may have heard the recent catchphrase of the 3 Ps, protect residents, preserve housing, and produce new housing. So how do we implement these 3 levels? I am a practitioner. My job is creating affordable housing. That's what I do when I show up to work. At that first level, we avoid discriminating by making our rent-up process fair and equitable, regardless of an applicant's characteristics. So somebody seeking a home in one of our properties will submit a pre-application with basic information about their household during a 2 to 3 week application period, and help is available for those who need an accommodation if they have a disability. And when the application window closes, a lottery will randomly assign a number to all of the applications, and that number will determine the order in which our property manager reviews those applications. The screening process then is the same for all applications. Our property manager, the John Stewart Company, will make sure that the household sizes and the incomes match up with the housing that's available, and that the applicant meets the affordability requirements that apply in that case. And then everybody goes through a criminal background screening and regular kind of rental history like any apartment. Anyone denied an apartment has a chance to appeal, and their application will get reconsidered if it does turn out that an accommodation is needed again based on a disability or a special circumstance. So that's the first level. At the second level, we pursue fair housing by affirmatively marketing apartments and considering if a rental preference is legal there. So affirmative marketing, the way we do it is that means placing targeted advertising in general interest media, but also in media serving racial, ethnic, and language minorities. Plus sending materials to local agencies, community agencies in the area of the new apartment building, and translating materials into languages that the local jurisdiction has identified as priorities for residents with limited English proficiency. So RCD, where I work, our property management partner, the John Stewart Company, does all this, is the one that does all this marketing and leasing activities. On our website, we have a list of upcoming properties where you can find out when those pre-application processes are coming up so that you can know, keep an eye out for when to apply. And we'll usually post a sign on the construction site so folks can know. So what about these preferences? We are often asked by a local jurisdiction to give an incentive for people in the local area to get priority for these new apartments, either for local residents or local workers or more recently car-free households. And part of my job is to help find out whether a preference is legally defensible. So here's what RCD's fair housing attorneys advise. In order for a preference to be allowed under fair housing laws, the racial composition of the local area that they want to be incentivized may not be less diverse than that of the surrounding region and state. In some locations, in Oakland, that works. It's very diverse, it kind of matches the region, kind of matches the state. We can do it in Oakland. In others, that can be achieved when you add the local workforce. But if those standards can't be met, then giving a preference will perpetuate whatever segregation the community has inherited from that history. And that's not legal. And that was the case in Fairfax. So we were not able to have a local preference in Fairfax. Another way we've seen local preferences pass muster previously is if it's just one priority among a whole variety of priorities. And I don't know if it's still the case, but a few years ago, the Marin Housing Authority had such a preference where that was one amongst many. When you layered them together, they collectively did not have a disparate impact on protected classes, because in addition to local residents, there was also a disability or being homeless or being a senior or being a veteran. And so together, it passed muster. The car-free preference is a more recent request. That came up in Walnut Creek, where we had a very low parking ratio that the city was nervous about. And when we asked our fair housing attorneys, can we give a preference for car-free living? And that just kind of mystified them, and they just said, no, too complicated, we don't know how to defend that, so let it go. So maybe somebody will figure that out in the future. Now, some cities with historically lower income neighborhoods of color under high displacement pressures are experimenting with a new type of housing preference, a new type of local preference. They are giving residents of that district a priority to a portion of the new homes in a new development. And with the goal of keeping a community of color together in the face of displacement, where whole neighborhoods are getting scattered to the outer East Bay or outer regions of the Bay Area. And it's interesting, it kind of flips traditional fair housing on its head. And so we're very curious to see how that evolves, because that is something we see a lot of in the East Bay and South Bay, and in San Jose, Latino community. In Berkeley, the African American community in South Berkeley really wants to not be totally decimated. So we're keeping our eye out for when that's appropriate. When a local preference is not possible, local agencies can still help folks be ready to apply, to prepare a successful application by knowing what the eligibility criteria will be and what documentation will be needed as part of the application process. Okay, that's the second level. What is this third level? The third level of fair housing strategies will really require action by the city, county, regional, and state government. And it's exciting to see how much new legislation is being proposed at the state level this year in particular. We need those public subsidies and inclusionary housing requirements to cap rents and to build new affordable housing and preserve at-risk housing. We need timely planning approvals to create any new homes at any affordability level. And we need tenant protections to prevent displacement due to gentrification. The equitable allocation of housing goals across all regions and housing element implementation with real incentives and teeth, which I'm hoping Megan will talk about, they're all needed to make sure that jurisdictions fulfill their responsibilities. So basically that third strategy is we need places where people can move in. We need more housing. We just need more to give folks the chance to be where they want to be. And the likelihood of new affordable housing being built really hinges on two key factors: financial feasibility and the risk associated with the approval process. So what goes into financial feasibility? It depends on efficient operating costs. It depends on the size of the development. In order to maintain a 100% affordable housing development well over the long term, we really need about 40 to 50 apartments at a minimum, and then it starts to pencil out, and we can spread the fixed costs across all of the homes. And it makes it also possible to locate on-site resident supportive services when you have a bigger development. The amount of public investment and local public investment and rental subsidy are key to competing for those state funds. The cost of the development, including land, local impact fees, and construction. Of course, the costlier the land, the greater the need for higher density to reduce the per unit costs. Efficient design helps. Building a 4-story building on a compact site is going to cost less than building a spread out building over a larger site on 2 stories. And what is the public infrastructure that the housing development is going to be required to build? How much sewer and stormwater systems, how much sidewalks and roads and crosswalks or utility undergrounding am I going to be asked to build? All of these factors determine financial feasibility. The local approval risk factors that we evaluate include the calculus of what kind of a shooting gallery are we going to be going through to get to the approvals. And that can really put a chilling effect on new housing. Remember the anecdote of the Victory Village in Fairfax? That was a multi-year approval process that involved 12 public meetings, a referendum, threatened lawsuit, several near deal killing moments. and that was to build senior housing, sponsored by a local church. So, yeah. And those who may not be aware of that process, the town had previously designated that site, the church site, as a housing opportunity zone, rezoned it, but mistakenly passed the rezoning as a resolution instead of an ordinance. And when it resumed it to actually do it as an ordinance years later, a community member gathered the 500 or so signatures necessary to force a repeal of the ordinance and a 1-year moratorium on any comparable rezoning. Mind you, the petition apparently that was used in that referendum was so misleading that even a Christ Lutheran Church member signed it, thinking that it was actually in support of her development. So based on our Victory Village experience, it does seem that some folks have the goal of drawing out the approval process to really wear down the developer, because the preference is for no new housing, be it affordable or otherwise. So the new state laws that are coming out to expedite approvals for affordable housing outside of environmentally sensitive areas and for some supportive housing are really starting to make a difference, and I hope that we will continue to see that. I think there's a lot of fear about losing local control. That is sort of the hot button issue, certainly here in Marin, but I think elsewhere all around the Bay. And I would like us to figure out a way of letting local governments still feel in control and with that role, however, not able to avoid stepping up and playing the role that each locality has to play to handle the growth that we are experiencing Bay Area-wide and statewide. So what made the difference in Fairfax? It was really sustained pressure from community members. I'm seeing some of our favorite community members here today. Thank you, Liesl. And grassroots groups like the Marin Environmental Housing Coalition, Coalition for a Livable Marin, Marin Organizing Committee, and the Marin Interfaith Council made all the difference to get Victory Village approved. These local advocates will continue to be helpful to find a way to let the governments feel still in control while still requiring them to do their parts to make California's growth in an equitable way. So going back to that night when I first heard about the historical marketing piece from Fairfax, that wasn't the only message I heard that night. I heard actually a lot of other public comments from other community members who went on record as eager to welcome their new low-income neighbors to the community, to get to know them and offer them a ride into town and offer them a hand in their new gardening beds. And that is the vision that I hope we can all work toward for creating equitable housing choices, more choices in our communities.
Hey, thank you, Alicia. So last but not least, I want to invite Megan.
Great, thanks. How's the sound for everybody? Great, perfect. Well, thank you for spending your Sunday with us. This is so nice for me. So coming from the state, use this instead? All right, let's try that. So coming from the state, I represent government. And I think you heard from Jessica that it wasn't just, a few racists in a community that kept integration from happening, that these were real government policies that promoted segregation over time. And as a member of the government today, it's important for us to look inward and look deeply at our policies we have in place potentially still promoting or encouraging that segregation to happen, and then also what are we doing to affirmatively recognize the role that we've played in the past and work to affirmatively further fair housing going forward. And so what kind of proactive approach are we taking along with just stopping the pain, stopping what has brought us here? And at HCD, I'm lucky to have a very supportive director who came with a strong moral belief in affirmatively furthering fair housing and in inclusive communities. But there are also legal reasons that are pushing us to do this. So we have a moral and a legal obligation to be thinking about what our role is and how do we move forward. And for HCD, so I'm from I'll occasionally use an acronym, but I'm from the California Department of Housing and Community Development, so HCD. But our approach is really that there is just untapped potential to use our policy abilities to prevent further segregation and concentrations of poverty, as well as encourage access to opportunity. And we see that as really two paths, our both and approach. So how do we look at increasing access, increasing choice in high resource communities to increase inclusivity there, where we know that the residents there, even when you hold constant race and income and all these other factors, you see greater upward economic mobility, you see improved health outcomes, even length of life. You see that there are higher earnings for children when they grow up, that there is higher educational attainment potential. So in those communities where we see that have been higher resourced as a result of government policies, have been given more resources over time, and that people in those communities have had access to low interest capital and the ability to own homes for hundreds and hundreds of years. That how do we look at increasing access to those communities to a more diverse population? But then also not ignoring that we have lots of segregated, concentrated areas of poverty here in California that do not have access to those resources. So places where we have lower resources need more direct investment. We need more community development investment. We need infrastructure, economic development, transportation investments, things that can begin to address some of those disparities from hundreds of years of disinvestment. And for us, we're not affirmatively furthering fair housing unless we're doing both of those things. So it is not about ignoring parts of California and just shifting to have all people live in one kind of place. It's about creating opportunity from both of those avenues. Like I said, this is something that data and research says has proven time and time again to have enormous benefits. And it's something that I think we all like to believe is getting better naturally over time, that it's one of these things where we got rid of these policies and now it's gonna take time, but it's gonna slowly get better. But I think when you look at it, it's a problem that's actually getting worse, not better. So since 2000, the growth in poor population for California's 10 largest metros was an average of 28%. But in the highly concentrated areas of poverty, the growth of the poor population was an average of 53%. So our poorest areas are getting more concentrated with poverty, not less, less integrated. And I'll tell you, when I look at high resource communities in California, and I look at how much affordable housing there is in those communities, it is not a lot. When over time, in the last decade, when we look at where new construction, large family, affordable housing has gone, 42% of it has gone into high segregation, high poverty census tracts. Those only represent 12% of the state. So 42% of our affordable housing is going into 12% of the state, and that's the highest segregation, highest poverty census tracts. So what about the highest resource areas? Only the highest resource areas by our methodology represent 20% of the census tracts in the state. Only 6% of our new construction large family affordable homes went into those census tracts in the last decade. That's not choice, right? People absolutely should have choice. And if that means living in the community that you've lived in for generations, even if it is lower resourced, like, we are not asking you to move. We are certainly saying we should be investing in those communities in a better way, but it isn't choice if 42% of what we have to offer is in high poverty, high segregation census tracts, and only 6% is in the highest resource areas. Then that isn't inclusive. And affordable housing is just a benefit in every community. But this imbalance in our portfolio means that lower income households just have less access. And that disparity I just talked about is not because groups like Alicia are saying, oh, I only want to build in high poverty census tracts. No. It is also a result of a string of housing policies. If you knock on the door of a high resource community over and over and over again, trying to build 5 units, 10 units of affordable homes, or even just building duplexes in a single family neighborhood, things that are gonna increase access for lower income households and disproportionately for protected classes, then if you are gonna stop knocking at that door, if time and time again, you're told no. And something we hear from local governments a lot is when we say, why hasn't more affordable housing been built in your community? Well, we hear, we have no control over that. Nobody came and asked us to build affordable housing. You can't judge us by whether we've met our affordable housing goals or not, because maybe people just don't want to build here. But then when we say anything on the table about taking away local control in order to make it easier to build, it's, we don't have any control, but don't take away our local control. And so there is a dichotomy happening here where we, as California, we are a very progressive state, but we do actually really kind of like local control. We like the idea that a community gets to kind of shape how it looks and these kinds of things. And I take it at face value. I think when communities say things like, we want to prevent the urbanization of our small town character, that coded language allows people who are racist to hide behind people who don't see that that is preventing inclusion in their community. And I mean, there are cities in California that have that on the books as part of their laws that say, the reason that we get to vote on every single rezoning is because it's very important to prevent urbanization. And they don't hear anything wrong with that statement. But over time, we are not doing anything to unlock that segregation that redlining helped put in place, that racially restrictive covenants put in place long after they were explicitly repealed. So we continue to shape that way, and as I said, I think a lot of the data shows it's getting worse, not better. So what is the state? What is me trying to do about this? What are we working towards? So we have a few different levers to try and counteract some of this, and there's really been a confluence of events over the past few years that have helped us have levers that weren't there before. So I've been in affordable housing for about 15 years now, but I'm the daughter of parents who owned a studio apartment, so I feel like I've been paying attention to these issues much longer. But for the beginning of time, people said, oh, there are all these great housing laws on the books. The Fair Housing Act, there's Housing Element Law that's intended to do all these great things, but there's no teeth. And so the 2017 housing package, which we throw around that term a lot in Sacramento, but basically a collection of 15 new laws that was designed to kind of pick away at a lot of the loopholes that had existed, has passed. And we are in the beginning of getting to implement those things. And then in the last year, we had 2 new laws in addition to that whole package that allowed us to really take a look at some of our long existing land use policies, and they really codified some of what the Obama administration had tried to do around affirmatively furthering fair housing. So even because of AB 686, even if the federal administration decides to sort of roll back some of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rules about implementing the Fair Housing Act, those are the law of the land here in California. I was on a panel with Richard Rothstein, who wrote The Color of Law, and we were talking about how we get a special little time capsule here in California. So President Obama is still president. It's 2015. The HUD rule from 2015 is still the law of the land. But the other big piece is here in California, we have something that was the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. So this policy has been around more than 2 decades now, more than 3 decades about. And it was started with a grant from HUD with the idea of how do we promote inclusive communities. So I, as the state, look at demographic projections for a region. I assign each region of the state a projection of what their housing need is for the next basically 10 years. And then that region delegates that down to each jurisdiction, and that's their housing goal, their regional housing need allocation that they have to plan for. And the law is very explicit about this, we call it the RHNA, about the RHNA. You need to be balancing income distributions, you need to be promoting inclusivity. There's a lot of fair housing rules in the law about this. But there was nothing saying that they had to follow it. So as of last year, we now provide oversight to each region to double check, did you follow the law when we gave you your number and you delegated it to your jurisdictions? So that is now an oversight power that we never had before, and that law got a lot more explicit about the need to affirmatively further fair housing when you give out that number. So if you have, I mean, this is a Southern California example, but I think you all appreciate it, but in the last cycle, the Southern California Association of Governments provided Beverly Hills housing goal of 3 for basically the next 10 years. They provided Azusa, which is exactly the same size geographically as Beverly Hills, but is predominantly lower income people of color, with a housing goal of greater than 600. So those are different goals, and there was different political power involved in how those goals were assigned. We now get to double check that whatever that number is that's given out is quantitatively based in where are the jobs? Are you balancing income distributions? Are you planning for more lower income housing in high resource communities? Are you looking to integrate communities? Are you looking at where transit is? Are you looking at where high quality schools are? And these are questions we are now allowed to ask before those numbers are assigned. There's still, this is what I said, there's still a balance. It's still the region that gets to develop the methodology. We still are trying to promote the ability for regions and local governments to have a lot of say in how their communities are shaped, but we are the double check to say, are you following the law? Are you meeting the law's statutory objectives? Also, as I mentioned, the 2015 HUD rule, AB 686 now requires that from 2021 forward, all the jurisdictions, when they make their housing plans, we as a state review their housing plans. They're called housing elements, and we find them either in or out of compliance. They need to show that the way that they have done their zoning supports affirmatively furthering fair housing. So if they are planning for all of their multifamily housing, all of their lower income housing in the worst part of town, they are not following that law. And that is a new teeth that we have. And then finally, from back in 2017, AB 72 was passed, which for the first time sort of answered this question of how is the law enforced? Up until then, public interest law projects and law groups or developers like RCD, if they saw the law was being broken, they had to sue the jurisdiction themselves. There's a big disincentive for a developer that's trying to build housing in a community to sue that community. You may only get that one bite at the apple. You may never get invited back to that community again, and certainly they're not going to do things like donate land or contribute to the development, which is part of how what you need to show the state in order to get matching resources. So AB 72 says that HCD can go to the Attorney General and say, this is an egregious thing going on, and you need to get involved. And we can do that for a variety of reasons. If housing element law is being broken, if density bonus law is being broken, which is a wonky thing, I won't talk about that too much. But also if land use fair housing law is being broken. So if we have enforcement power that we haven't used yet around that, but that is an opportunity for us to say that the Fair Housing Act is being broken. And that's previously only been public interest lawyers who've sued cities for violation of that. So, I mean, as Jessica said, people are smarter too. They aren't as explicit in their policies always. A lot of times there are delay tactics and things like that. But if a jurisdiction is denying affordable housing based on racist commentary, they don't get an off. They don't get a free pass for that. If you are approving housing that does not promote diversity and inclusivity in your community, if you're okay with a luxury single family home, but when you get community opposition that says we don't want to look like such and such community as a way to not build a fourplex, as a way to not build a multifamily building, and that's happening over and over again, that could be a violation of the Fair Housing Act because you are purposely perpetuating policies to keep that segregation in place. And so those are new authorities that we have. And we are also looking inward. We fund affordable housing, and we are trying to look at what we do to cause that discrepancy I talked about in the beginning. So why does 42% of what we fund end up in high poverty, high segregation areas? Why does only 6% end up in higher resource neighborhoods? A lot of that is how hard it is and how expensive it is to build in higher resource neighborhoods, especially when you have very strong coordinated opposition. But what can we do to make it a little easier for the developer that is willing to try, that's willing to go stand up and have tomatoes thrown at them in front of city council? And so we're looking at what we can do there to make that just a little bit easier.
Thank you. Okay, before I turn to the audience members for your questions and your comments, I'd like to actually ask all panel members 3 questions. And the first question that I have is, how can we help our neighbors and ourselves get more comfortable with the changes we all need to make in our communities so we can collectively address the housing crisis, which is disproportionately affecting disadvantaged minority groups? In no particular order in terms of who would like to answer this question.
I have one part of an answer, which is I live in North Berkeley, and there's a BART station there, which is surrounded by a big parking lot, and now we're talking about developing the city and BART are talking about entering into a memorandum of understanding to develop something on the parking lot, like housing and parks and a bike lane. And so at a community meeting last spring, one of the comments that I loved was, if we can't just say we don't want change, because if we don't do anything different, change will happen. It's just not the change that we're thinking that we're preventing. If we don't build more, filled in with more housing on this site, we will become such an exclusive neighborhood. You know, we think of ourselves as diverse and funky in Berkeley, and we won't be diverse or funky if our homes are all going for $2 million. So we need to build more, a lot more housing. And so that just, that way of saying that, of getting more comfortable of like, oh, you know, that change will be happening. We humans hate change, and so we just have to start to be able to imagine the beautiful upside of how we all can change, and that we're all gonna have to hold hands together. There's no one community where it's gonna get all dumped on, and if we all hold hands and do it together, I think that can get people feeling more comfortable.
So this is what I've been spending a lot of time thinking about lately, which is why I've been running these surveys, trying to figure out what it is that people are opposed to in terms of housing development. And I think one of the things to say about this is that there's probably no one-size-fits-all way to talk about what we need to do. It's going to, different language is going to compel different places differently, right? In some places, it's going to be compelling that we cannot house our workforce. In other places, it's going to be compelling that we cannot house our children. In other places, it's going to be compelling that we are destroying the environment by commuting 2 hours a day. And so if we have to decide, we have to figure out what goal or set of goals is going to motivate a community to agree essentially to densify. And there doesn't have to be, we don't have to fix all the problems at once. Literally just building some more housing is the first step. And so if we try to figure out how do we build more housing as a first step, we can, I think, figure out what kinds of conversations work to motivate that conversation. And it's, I live in the Central Valley. So we face very different kinds of pressures and demands than you all do here in the Bay Area. But California is growing. We're not growing as rapidly as we thought we were, and we're not growing as rapidly as we thought we were because we don't have enough housing, so we might lose a congressional seat because of it, but that's a side note. So it's important to know, though, that California has always been a place that has attracted people. And so, as Alicia said, the change is demographic growth is going to happen in California, and it's going to happen particularly in places that are very attractive to live and where we have job growth. And so we have to figure out a way to manage that growth collectively. And, if we're going to put all the people in the Central Valley because we have a lot of space, then we need some high-speed rail to get people there, right? So, there are choices we can make that are going to allow for different kinds of conversations, but ultimately change is going to happen. I liked Alicia's comment.
All right, thank you. Yes.
Well, I like Jessica's comment. I do think it is different messages for different places, but I think it is a wide net is the only thing that is going to get us here and get us to where we need to be, which is a more inclusive California. And I think that most of us want that. I think we wouldn't necessarily live in California if we didn't hold to some of those values of inclusivity. And I think that we don't always know that small decisions prevent that inclusion. And, it's things like realizing that maybe if there was a duplex where there's a single family home on your street, that it might not be that big a deal. And that maybe an accessory dwelling unit in your backyard or your neighbor's backyard is a little bit of density that maybe you wouldn't feel that strongly. And it's also realizing that people who live in inclusive communities talk about how valuable it is to them. And that we all, I think, there are studies, I don't have my data on this right now, but basically that both people of color and white households report that when they are looking for housing, they actually are looking for more diverse neighborhoods. That I think we want to be around people that have had different lived experiences from us, but it's that threat of change to the place we are right now that feels scary. But I think we all have benefited from knowing people that lived a different life than our parents lived. And I think I really benefit from being of a generation where, all of my mom's siblings married people that looked different than them, and that I got to go to a high school with people from probably more than 20 different countries, and that those things are good in our lives. And I think diversity and inclusivity are actually goals, not something to try and prevent.
Thank you. So the second question that I have is there a limit to the number of residents a city can house? Should cities have the ability to control their population size?
Well, I'll just say that, like, the law is pretty specific on this, well, I guess the law is somewhat specific on this, but that growth caps tend to be a problem, and that I think a lot of times we feel like a city is built out when we haven't looked at ways in which we could grow more creatively. And I think we don't realize the benefits you get from just a little bit more density. I live in a single-family neighborhood in Sacramento, but it is mostly built in the 20s at 10 units to the acre. So I get a lot of density benefits even from that. And I enjoy living near a part of town that is probably at 40 or 50 units to the acre. Because when you have density, you also get more things. Like, you get access to more kinds of restaurants, and you get access to more kinds of events, cultural events, because you can't actually support those kinds of things if you have too homogeneous a community and you don't have enough density.
I think maybe my answer is it depends. In general, I would want to say, well, we should all just sort of proportionally grow, more or less. Then I think about fires, and then there are maybe areas that don't make so much sense for there to be a whole lot of human growth in the fire-prone region. So I think there maybe is, a bunch of caveats on that.
That sounds right. You made me think of more things to say, but I said at the beginning that we help do this sort of regional housing need planning, and it definitely is not our goal to just like maximize how many potential people there are. It's to think about where we want there to be more homes for people. And I mean, there was a rural community where we were giving them their housing need number, and California is changing, and some of our rural areas do not support some jobs have left those communities. They are sometimes, we have had major paradigm shifts. Logging is not what it once was, And so if I'm looking at a community that has a huge vacancy rate, even during like even during accounting for seasonal visitors and things, then no, I don't think we should be putting more people into those communities. But if I'm seeing low vacancy rate, high overcrowding, and high cost burden, those are signs there's pressure on that community, and there are people that want to live there, and there are people that are making sacrifices to live there. They are paying big pieces of their income every month, or they are living in less than healthy conditions in order to be in that place. And that's a place where I think we want to be unlocking more housing options.
So that's a great answer, and I think that the problem comes when some cities can limit their growth and others don't, right? That's where we get into, that's what creates segregation, is that it's the most exclusive places that tend to be the most oriented toward no growth, and that's the inequality that creates the bad outcomes that I see in my work.
Thank you. And then the last question before I turn it over to the audience members is, what are the key issues each city could consider to overcome impediments to fair housing?
I guess I'll take a stab at sort of starting here. I think one thing is to sort of what we talked about a little bit ago, which is to figure out what the message is for that community that motivates people to agree that densification at some level brings benefits, as Megan said. I think it's a really important point, and I think that's one place to start.
I'll just say that I think one of the things we don't always talk about in this conversation, but affordable housing that's subsidized by the state or by a housing program, often also has accessibility requirements on that housing. And so that when you build housing in the private market, you don't necessarily need to make your homes or units accessible for people with mobility and sensory disabilities. So when I look at a community that has 0 state subsidized affordable housing in it, I also look at a community that may have no homes that are starting out being accessible for persons with disabilities. And so you can have an entire community where a group of people are starting out with just a physical barrier to finding a home there. And so I think that is another piece of the affordable housing puzzle we don't always talk about, is that it is also a way to unlocking accessibility for persons with mobility and sensory disabilities.
And I think about the kind of three-legged stool of housing, transit, and jobs, and that those three things, cities and really at the regional level, I mean, I think that's one of the challenges in the Bay Area is the zoning control is at the city or town level, or maybe county level for unincorporated, but we are in a regional economy where we easily drive across a bridge or go through under a tunnel, in a BART to get to our work. But that's not how land use is approved. And so looking at, and I see, the legislation that just stalled out, State Bill 50, where that was one, the goal of, just raising the zoning for more housing, where good quality transit is and where jobs are, makes us, seems attractive to me, but then it makes me worry that, like, wow, in certain neighborhoods, folks will just say, oh, no transit, cancel all the bus lines, and that's the solution, and then we'll be fine. And that's not the goal. And so it just makes me feel like, the kind of the discussion, I hope it's not too triggering to talk about CASA, but in the Bay Area of like looking at transportation and housing issues together and where jobs are and what kind of jobs are, is that we can alleviate, a lot of, in every single approval process I go through, traffic is a concern across the Bay Area, and that's like, we can actually address a lot of these different issues by looking at them together.
Thank you very much. Now, this is the time of our session or a process where we now, I'd like to open up the floor for questions and comments. And again, I want to remind folks that if you do have a comment or a question, to limit it to 1 minute. And I'll also remind the panel members to provide your response 2 minutes or less. Starting with Mr. Dave Curry. No, there were 3 questions that were, was that the second question that I posed or the third question? Okay, sorry, my apology. The third question then.
We did 3.
There were 3. There were 3, Dave.
But if you have another question.
Any other questions, Dave? Okay. That said, I'd like to again open up the floor to any members of the audience. Yes, sir? Yes. If there's a microphone, I believe there's a wireless microphone here, so that if you can, you don't have to move. There'll be a rover. Oh, thank you, Chandra. There's a.
To me, all this is happy talk. Not happy talk for second units and backyards and splitting up houses, but in terms of building development, under market development, nothing's going to happen in Marin County without, well, we've been, affordable housing committee's been up for about 15 years. I've been involved anyway with the group, and we've been on about 20 years. And the last affordable housing in our community about 20 years ago. We've been trying, and we come close, and everybody gets excited, but at the end of the day, there's way too less money. There's a gap between what it actually costs and what the conventional and traditional sources, the usual philanthropy, the usual bonds, the usual Who has the money? The people who didn't pay the taxes. So they set up these foundations. They're loaded with money, and the literature's saying they want to start spending it on things like the housing crisis. But if you try to get over that transom inside that building and talk to those people, you can leave voicemails, and you can leave emails, and you can make passionate pleas, and we've had no luck. We're looking for people who know how to get over that transom and help us. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a microphone that's active that's,
I think he's going to try.
did you try it, Don?
Is this working? No.
No.
Okay, that's okay. If you can just speak loudly, that'd be great. Carrie?
We can repeat it back to
Yes.
the audience if that's helpful.
Yes, Carrie.
I heard all the positions, very well phrased. But the discussion ignores the fact to me that Marin is far and away the most inequitable county in the state. I mean, far away. So I don't know that there's any normal policy decision from the state or anywhere else that makes a difference. I would wonder this, that when you're number one by so far, whether special remedies can be required, for instance, local control. Local control has created all of this inequity. Perhaps if the state is willing to spend the money, they should just force it on Marin County. My interest, my family's interest, has not been served well by local control here in this county.
Thank you, Carrie.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I just want to sort of comment on that comment, which is that I find that local control is really the producer of all of the patterns that I find in my research. And if you compare to other nations, we are an outlier. The United States is an outlier in the way in which we allow local communities to control our housing development, our land use development. And so one response here is that we might take a look at places outside of the United States to have a better sense of what is possible from a top-down approach. A couple of people have said already, local control is a very, very powerful argument that gets made in the United States. So I don't see a lot of political traction there, but at least it could start the conversation.
Thank you. Others? Yes, Steve.
At least two of you mentioned jobs as being an appropriate consideration criterion for the location of housing. My jurisdiction recently essentially said for a new development, we want to give an affirmative preference for people who are working locally but now commuting in from far away. Do you find that to be an acceptable affirmative preference or not?
So, I mean, Alicia spoke to this, and I will say fair housing is not as black and white as we all want it to be, but adding in a work preference often can make a preference more equitable than it would have been previously. So, for example, I mean, most of California is already segregated. So when you have a live local preference, like for people who are already living here, that might just perpetuate the segregation that's there already. When you add a work preference, that certainly expands it quite a bit and makes it less, there's much less potential for it to be an issue, a fair housing issue. But basically you do what Alicia was talking about of kind of looking at what would be the impact of adding in that preference. Would it be likely to be a more or less diverse population that could live in the building if you added in that preference? And that's kind of how you'd evaluate where it would fall on sort of the fair housing scales. But definitely it would be less problematic than just a live preference for a place that is segregated.
Sorry, actually, I want to add a little bit to the previous question. Is that okay? Okay. The previous question about how do we, if local control has not served us well, what can we do to move forward and beyond that? And I think part of the challenge is that, okay, who are the local deciders? The local politicians who have the local control. Who wants to give up power? That's a tough sell. When you go to the next level, the state politicians, where do they get their start? Local government. Who do they go to for their fundraising and advice? The local. So the kind of the the farm teams or whatever for the state politicians are our local politics. And so I don't have a solution to that, but that is part of the challenge, is that the folks who are in the deciding seats at both the regional, local, regional, state level are the folks who, came out of benefiting from local control and that power. And so I think you have a great question.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead, Carrie, and then we'll move on to the next person.
I guess what I'm saying is not a rule for the agenda, but when you're number one in the state, couldn't there be a legislative remedy? We should make an example out of Marin, is what I'm saying.
And I did also forget my favorite answer to the question of how we can, what can we do, is every single one of you could become a city council person, but you could also become part of the planning commission. People don't think about the power that a planning commission has, but it's a lot. And it's a valuable way to spend some time.
Right. Woman over here? Yes, ma'am. There's a microphone that's going around, so feel.
I can talk pretty loud.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
So, I live in Marin, West Marin, San Geronimo Valley. Some of the things that come up in conversation when we talk about housing and the housing crisis have to do with the term affordable. And this, for many people living in affordable housing or understanding what affordable housing is, creates a red flag about those people, those poor people. Affordable is different than that stereotype of what affordability is. Affordability is for people who are what I used to call the middle class, the formerly middle class, of people who are being squeezed out because housing is either very low income or as we need, and also very, very expensive. So I think some of the things we talk about are community housing, and not just affordable housing, because when we think about any kind of housing in my community, we like to think of it as available for people up and down the strata of income, as well as diversity for all these other reasons that we need to diversify our community. But we need to diversify it economically as well as for all of the protected and unprotected classes.
Thank you. Yes, John.
I would dovetail on that. We have to talk to specific people in the various neighborhoods about who they have relationships with. They have relationship with domestic workers and their families, with gardeners, with police and firefighters, with other people. Don't talk about affordable housing, but talk about, don't you want to accommodate the people you have relationships with in those areas? And then also building the constituency of yes in my backyard. There's enough people in neighborhoods that we can mobilize to say yes in my backyard and to confront the people that want no in my backyard. If we continue moving forward with priority development units and things like that, and next round of that, we need to move in that area and make the possibility of philanthropists, yes, I know, to do that if we have access to them, but also nonprofit and profit developers. I mean, that's been in the past. I don't know where we are in that. We used to do Ecumenical Housing Association and profit developers. They could decide to get a loss in one area and build and have profits in one area and get a loss in this area. Those kind of partnerships could be helpful.
Thank you, John. There's a person who had their hand up. Yes, ma'am. There's a microphone that's come to you.
Thank you.
Greetings. Before I even begin to speak, I'm going to do something a little bit differently, but my spirit beckons me to do so. So, dear merciful and most gracious God, I beckon you, O God, to allow for me to be a vessel that is receptive to you and which you want to be articulated. Amen. So, I'm coming to this meeting. I dwell domiciled in San Anselmo for the past 3 years, originally from the Bay Area. What I want to bring forth is Marin City, Sausalito. Now, for 3 years, I lived here, but I was totally oblivious to the existence of Marin City. I stumbled upon it by happenstance. But the irony is that when I call Marin City, it comes up as Sausalito. When I go to Marin City, I was scared to come back to San Anselmo because of the big old concrete facade of a freeway entrance that's really just covering a street. And I've had the opportunity to go into Bayside MOK on a plethora of occasions. And when you go there, you find it very interesting that you see predominantly people of color that goes to this particular school. Like, I've only encountered one Caucasian student on the various times that I have visited the school there. And you see this profound concentration of African Americans in Marin City. And Sausalito was right there, but there's this fervent aspiration to preserve this orchestrated, I would say, strategically promulgated divide. And there's profuse opportunity for a community to manifest, but there's no true aspiration for it to culminate. So now, predicated upon recent communications that I've became privy to, you have Michael's development, I believe, that has kind of gone over the head of the community with the approval of the county, is now being contracted, I believe, to begin the process of being able to build. And you have the emphasis being on the Golden City. Now, the Golden City, predicated upon my understanding, came out of the World War II housing for shipbuilding persons who migrated to be a part of helping to build ships. And when they completed that process, they wanted to tear it all down, but the community, the pioneers, fervently and gallantly garnered support to manifest Marin City. So I hear all that you guys are saying, and it's really, really phenomenal. And being on the planning commission and so on and so forth. But it's like you want to redevelop or tear it down, but are you going to put everyone back there as a word prior to tearing it down? Are you going to tear it down and displace them? And if you displace them, where are they going to go in Marin? And Marin, where the reality is everyone, to a large extent, economical solvency makes them not have the capacity or fortitude to remain there. So how can displacement not manifest in this season? And really and truly, what are we really going to do to realistically really provide them the right, not the opportunity, but the right to remain somewhere that is actually historical? And I have a son, and every time I take my son somewhere in Marin County, people always say, "Oh, you look strong. Are you going to be a basketball player?" To my 5-year-old son, he is the only African American in his entire daycare. So there's a profuse level of ignorance amongst those who are the most educated. And so if you are educated and you're occupying these positions of power and you are oblivious to how people really, really exist, how can you implement policy that can generate anything that wholesomely can come out of it? And the ignorance, is not intentional, but because of the lack of other ingredients or seasoning of humanity in Marin, we're eating this bland meal, this bland cuisine that we're digesting, and we're not being nourished. And the outcome is being reflected. So it's my humble and fervent prayer that there is an effort to make sure that what is appropriate transpires in Marin City with regards to the development that is getting ready to commence without the city really currently being rightfully involved.
Would any of you want to respond? And I just want to thank you for that comment. Okay, not a problem. So we'll move on. Are there any other questions or comments? Yes, back there, and we'll go to Lysol.
I just want to reinforce what this woman said. I've been attending some meetings down in Marin City the last few months, and there's definitely not a sense of local control. The community feels very much put upon. So I was listening to the comments or the statements you made in the beginning, a couple of you, about the approval process, the difficulties for private developers going in with no clear expectation that they'll be able to complete their project because of what happens in the communities. Is there any sense that public development, public housing funds to local communities to build the housing and then possibly sell it to the future tenants or sell it to a management company? Like, is that a possibility? Is that something in the thought process? And the other question that came up is you talked about communities that have higher resources. And when I was listening to that, it seems that would be jobs and transportations and good schools. And I know that there was a moment in time when meeting RENA numbers was going to be tied to getting transportation funding. Can we get a way of providing local communities the ability to provide those higher resources to communities that don't have them, and then somehow find a way through that to incentivize cheaper, affordable housing? Thank you.
Okay. Any members of the panel may answer that question or questions.
Just that I think some of the ideas you brought up are, a lot of things are on the table right now, more so than in probably 30 years. I think people are trying to think creatively about different ways to get at this. And I haven't heard of any, to your first part about the locally, I think if I was understanding it correctly, sort of locally built public housing. Some of the bigger cities do that. I haven't seen past probably further down the population cities, like more suburban communities do that kind of thing. I don't know that that would overcome the opposition, but I think those are the kinds of things that are worth talking about to see what does help people feel more comfortable. I mean, Jessica said this, but we just need more. And so I think being creative about how we get there is important. There definitely have been conversations about RENA trading, RENA sharing, sorts of different ideas of, could a city that doesn't have housing pay another city to have more opportunity, more resources? I think there's still some itchiness around those ideas from a fair housing perspective of, did we really, we may have helped increase resources and opportunity to some degree, but we prevented more inclusivity in another place, and we sort of allowed that to continue and perpetuate. And so I think the goal really is to try and look at ways to at least allow more inclusivity. But I think the state is definitely looking at our community development resources from a perspective of, hey, we've underinvested for years in certain communities. How can we make amends there?
Any others who'd like to weigh in on a thought or comment or a question?
So I actually want to ask all of you, since you all will know this, is Marin City an incorporated city? No. That's the problem, right? You can't have local control if you aren't incorporated. And so the first answer about sort of how to make sure that marginalized communities don't get further marginalized is to make sure that they have a seat at the table. And Marin City does not have the right seat at the big table.
Okay. Liza? Yes.
I just wondering if somebody could maybe delineate, since it's on the title of today's event, what AB 686 is exactly and how it's going to impact, say, the process in local jurisdictions.
Sure. So AB 686 passed last year. It's a Santiago bill. It does a few different things, but one of the things it does is, I'll kind of break it into three different things. One thing it does is explicitly say that any public entity that controls housing and community development decisions or funds needs to explicitly, affirmatively further fair housing, that obligation is explicit. The other thing it does for local jurisdictions is, as part of their housing element, for any jurisdiction that's housing element, for all housing elements due from 2021 and beyond, so for all the communities here, the law will apply in the next time they do their housing element. It says two big things. One, that they need to include in their program section of their housing element an assessment of fair housing, so basically analyzing impediments and opportunities to fair housing in that community. And then part of what the housing element includes is, say your RHNA was 50, you need to include a sites inventory that shows us you've zoned enough, that you've set the table that that development could realistically happen. So that's in the housing element now. What AB 686 adds is that you need to plan those sites in accordance with your assessment of fair housing and in a way that affirmatively furthers fair housing. So we as the state, when we're looking, is this a compliant housing element? Is this an out of compliant housing element? One of the things we would now evaluate because of AB 686 is, where did you put your lower income sites? Where did you put your higher income sites? Does that make sense from a fair housing perspective? And I think that, combined with some prior legislation that also encourages sites to be more real, there needs to be a little bit more reality, but when you zone a site, that it could potentially become a development. I think I'm hopeful we'll be impactful in this next housing element cycle. But, of course, we'll see.
Okay. Any other members of the panel would like to answer? Okay. Next question. Yes.
Just a follow-up to that one.
Yes, go ahead. And then we'll go to the gentleman back there.
Thank you for raising 686. There are categories of protection, right?
Right, protected classes, yeah.
Protected classes. Explicitly, is source of income one of those, and is that automatically, therefore, in our fair housing rules in each of our jurisdictions?
Is a really good question. So source of income is an explicit protected class with respect to California fair housing law. What the courts have found is the way that it's written currently is that source of income is protected if that income comes to the tenant. So if I receive veterans benefits and that's how I pay my rent, if I receive Social Security and that's how I pay my rent, those are protected classes. You can't not rent to me because I'm a veteran living on veterans benefits. But up until now, that has not included source of income if that is a voucher to reduce your rent, because that is the government paying your landlord for a portion of your rent. And so up until now, that's not been protected. That is being debated in the legislature this year, whether source of income for voucher holders should become protected. But you actually asked a more interesting question, which I think is how is source of income in affirmatively furthering fair housing looked at? And definitely, it is something that I think we will explore further, but it is explicit that you need to be planning for lower income housing, and that there is a lot of explicitness into the law of how you will be held accountable for denying affordable housing that's presented to you. And I would say with our AB 72 authority, which allows us to contact the Attorney General, we are going to be a lot more, and I think this actually gets to Carrie's question from earlier, the state is going to be a lot more proactive than we've ever been before in enforcing the law and asking the Attorney General to step in if we see that jurisdictions are breaking the law.
Right, gentleman back there? Yes, sir.
Hi, this is a question for Megan. Hi, Megan. Jessica brought up the point earlier that people tend to really value their property and their children in these conversations, and they're concerned about their property values falling, crime rising. Are you aware of any efforts that the state has made to find and spotlight communities where both the state has been successful in building fair housing and high resource communities, and where the earlier residents in those communities are kind of happy with the changes that have been made?
That is such a, I would like to find that. We did commission a study because we don't always like to be pointing out bad actors, but I feel like we as the state end up in that role a lot, of saying, you're doing the wrong thing. But we did commission a study into positive housing practices. I don't remember one that was explicitly about kind of inclusivity practices, but there's definitely things we could look into. I mean, I think a really good case to look at is, some of you all may know about this, it was about a decade ago, but the city of Pleasanton was sued for they had a growth cap that was gonna prevent them from meeting their RHNA. They were denying multifamily zoning. They were doing all sorts of these things. And they were sued by public advocates and urban habitat on fair housing grounds. And the remediation that the judge proposed was they could not approve any commercial development until they got rid of their growth cap and they did rezoned multifamily around transit and other resourced areas. I'm probably blurring the lines of the case. Other people would know it better, but I think that would be a good example of like, hey, they were specifically going a different direction, and the legal case caused them to go in the other direction. I mean, I think it's been a pretty positive turn since then, but yeah, we could look for more examples like that where we have sort of a natural experiment we could point to.
So there's some academic.
I'm glad you know.
Yeah, there's a little bit of academic work on this. One is that there's actually pretty good evidence that once affordable housing gets built, people don't dislike it in their neighborhood. And so, there's a lot of caveats because it's hard to study these things, but generally speaking, that's true. It's also true that what Megan said, so I have this research that shows that places that get sued under fair housing laws actually successfully integrate. So they become, the growth of the population of people of color is really dramatic, and they become much more integrated economically. So whether or not the people like that, I mean, that's what's hard to know, right? Is that an okay scenario for the people who are there? And then it's hard to know, there are people who leave, right? That happens, you get sued, the people are so unhappy at the thought of integration that they move, and then if you ask the people who remain, are you happy, right, that's a weird sample, right? Mm-hmm. That's a selection of people who chose to stay even though their city had been sued. But nonetheless, I think the fact that we don't see a lot of movement out of cities in the lead up to or the enactment of these injunctions suggests that people don't hate it. Mm-hmm. Circumstantial.
And there have also been studies specifically about the impact of affordable housing on property values and surrounding neighborhoods. Yeah, and it's shown time and time again that there's not a negative effect. Often, I don't know if it's still up currently on the website of the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California, but they have a toolkit with a lot of research.
Community acceptance toolkit.
Yeah.
Thank you. Aura?
The website is nonprofithousing.org. .org. Thank you.
Yeah, you got it. I used to work there.
Yes, ma'am.
I'll try to make this quick. My name's Aura Hathaway, and I work with the team of many professional people with Golden Gate Village Resident Council plan to revitalize people and in place. Our first brick was historic preservation due to the actual way that it was designed and the reason it was designed and why we got it on the National Register as an historic district. Why it was placed on there is because there had never been African American historic preservation in any of three different categories: arts and cultures, maritime architecture, and manufacturing. So we also had a great strategist who's now gone but left us with a full strategy. The first brick is historic preservation because there is funding, federal funding. And there also is a path to land trust. There is an article that Louis Jordan said, after Michael said, we're, the developer, we're talking about everything. Everything's on the table, and Damon Connolly talked about home ownership. We've been speaking about a community land trust, because that's a way, it's sort of a movement. We had a nice meeting of land trusts, and it's a growing movement, a way that people can come in at different levels. Marin City was created as the most integrated, is still the most integrated place in Marin City. And what we'd like to see it be is a place that reflects how things can work, how people can work together. And now we're having a wide network. But I want to say thank you for your work, and also to say something about unincorporated. There's pros and cons, because our board of supervisors are pretty progressive, and they have made things happen in unincorporated Marin, which are now the towns and cities have to come upon, right? So I think the unincorporated can be a leader. And I also think this needs to happen for everybody, even in single homes and because many people are not touched by some things. And then in terms of Golden Gate Village, again, there's the disparate impact that, that so much of the land in Marin City has already been used and gobbled up for affordable housing. And then there's the whole CLAM, integration of, asking landlords to voluntarily rent to people a third of their income. And they're doing that, and they're growing that in West Marin, and I know we can do that in every community. We can learn from each other, and that's why we met, and that's why we're going to have a debate, and everybody can hear Louis Jordan and his side and Michael's, and Royce McLemore are going to debate on June 5th at McGinnis Parkway, 11 to 1:30. And so the Marin Coalition is putting it on. You can Google it this next Tuesday. I'm pretty sure if you really wanted to come, you could. But then again, I think that we really do need to have everything on the table until we have a complete scoping session, which is what happens for every project. And it should be that we follow at Golden Gate Village the same process that every community follows. And we know that HUD has allowed property to be leased. I think 99 years was the townhomes in Washington, D.C., a land trust, and they took less and less HUD money as the people created their equity. Then you have, you have places that are open. You can bring other people into the community. People have always wanted to come in, can buy in at the level, and can actually put the money into their community. It's a sustainable growth pattern instead of a public-private partnership, which takes the public trust off that land. So I think if you come, you'll be very excited to hear all of the details, any of you who are really interested in supporting one way or the other, so you will know the truth.
Thank you, Aura.
Wednesday, by the way, not Tuesday. It's on Wednesday.
Wednesday. Thank you. Next hand up. Yes, ma'am.
My question is, are there any options for people who need like emergency housing? And also, if you have any statistics of people who are already sharing their apartments or their homes. And also, I heard like parents having their children who has grown up. And what is it possible? Because I know that low-income housing takes very long to approve and to happen, but what can the community do? What can we do to make things possible, such as, I don't know, like community sharing house or, that kind of thing?
Anyone care to tackle that question?
So I can say that the increase in population in California without an increase in housing that is needed means that people are sharing living spaces, right? So that's what we know from a statistical standpoint, right? Is that there's lots more dwelling sharing than was previously the case. And you can just see that by the numbers. I don't have academic literature to recommend to you, but that's, I think we can see that from the past two censuses, actually. With respect to how to get more housing built, these folks are the experts here. So I know that in other places in the world, they build housing very fast. So we're pokey.
What's the fastest? No.
Well, things will start to get faster with the new legislation that went into effect over the last year, one of them is called Senate Bill 35, which allows for a 3-month approval process for housing that has at least 50% affordable for low-income families and is not in environmentally sensitive locations. And so that cuts out, depending on the location, that cuts out maybe a year or 3/4 of a year during the development process. So there's a similar type of legislation or that new law for supportive housing that allows for a quicker process. But I hear you that it still is going to take a good couple years. 2 to 3 years is lightning speed. 3 years is lightning speed. Victory Village took more like 6 years to get under construction. And so in the interim, there is still a need of short-term solutions, and I can't speak to that, unfortunately.
I'll just add to the SB 35 that, I mean, for us, so that's, still in the path of laws, a fairly new law. And so we're still kind of going through the phase of any new law where it exists and we have people try it out and they hit barriers and we have to help them overcome those barriers. But it is really pretty amazing. It basically means that we're able to walk that line I talked about earlier of it's out of our control, but don't take away our control, because if you're not meeting your housing goal number, then the law applies to you. And it doesn't mean that your housing goal is a building requirement, so it's like, yeah, so out of your control, right? Maybe there's no demand in your community, but this says if you aren't meeting those goals, then anybody who comes in and wants to build affordable housing on that site and meets objective standards gets to build it. And they get to build it ministerial, which means you can't go to 12 different meetings to get it approved. Is it the right box? Is it healthy and safe to live there? And denying that, there could be Housing Accountability Act concerns. So you can get fined the minimum fine is $10,000 a unit for denying an affordable development if you can't prove that there were objective reasons you denied it. So it's our hope that eventually that becomes just the standard practice for anybody in the state wanting to build affordable housing, is like, instead of a 6-year timeline, that you're moving to that 3-month phase. But people are resistant to change, and I think it'll take a while for us to get into the rhythm of that, but that is the law. And I think in terms of the immediate solutions, it is hard. And I mean, we are in a place where continuums of care are trying to help with emergency, getting us through this emergency time. But all we can do is really start to unlock these kinds of options. And I think, as Jessica said, not only are we seeing more, basically since the recession in 2008, we have seen very low household formation rates, which means people going off and forming a new household. So it is people living with their parents, it is people living with roommates, and it is, in a lot of places, more overcrowding than we've seen in a long time. So that's more than one person per room. So that doesn't sound so bad when you think about it, or when you first hear it, but it's okay, your kitchen is a room, your living room is a room, and your bedrooms are a room, and you have more than one person in each of those rooms per house, and we're seeing a lot of that.
I want to just add that you brought up it's a really good point, which is that the blockers of growth have a lot of power in our system. And there's some really excellent academic research showing that blockers use their blocking power to their advantage, and that they seek to delay development in order to get their way. Even if they don't win, even if they don't think that they're going to win, just drawing out the process to 6 years at least gives them 6 years without the development rather than 3 months without the development.
And it adds costs. I mean, I think to the gentleman's point about that gap between what it costs and how much financing we have is every day that you're delayed is money lost. And some people just have to give up At a certain point, they've just lost too much money to go forward. But the shorter we can get that delay, that yes, you need more philanthropy, yes, you need more capital, but you also just need shorter time periods so you have less wasted money.
And less skyrocketing housing values.
Yeah.
Right, thank you. Yes.
So I'm here today with my MOC hat on, and we're talking about local control, and we're talking about how long you have to wait for things to actually be built, even if you shorten that process and you stop people from weaponizing CEQA as a way to stop it, all those kinds of things that RCD experienced in Fairfax. So that's one of the reasons why we've been focusing on renter protections, and they're not fabulous, and they don't address overcrowding, but we got renter protections passed at the county and at Fairfax, and tomorrow night in Santa Fe at 7 o'clock, they will be considering the first reading of a draft ordinance for mandatory mediation and for a just cause for eviction ordinance at the Santa Fe City Council. So if you'd like to come and support that, come to Santa Fe tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, and you'll have a chance to speak and let the City Council know that you think renter protections are a good thing.
Thank you. We'll go to Jim, and then we'll go back this way, and then we'll go across the room.
Ben Carson / HUD has proposed a rule that would force mixed-status families out of public housing. Could you talk a little bit more about the strategy the state might have to fight against that, and what we can do in our local communities to fight against that? Thank you.
I wish I could. I don't know if the other panelists do. I mean, we're aware of what's going on. I would say that we don't have a strategy yet, but it is a problem, and it's something we will absolutely encounter here in California if it goes forward. So it's something we're thinking about, but I don't yet have a solution.
Okay. Yeah. Next question.
One of the issues affecting the housing crisis is not just the fact that we haven't had any new community housing resources, is the fact that what had been affordable housing in many communities have been turned into short-term housing, Airbnbs. In West Marin, we successfully passed a Measure W, which adds a tax onto short-term rentals, an additional tax in addition to the hotel tax. That part of the proceeds of that are to be used for affordable housing. Priorities are still to be set as to what that means. Is there any, another impact to, in addition to the Airbnbs, is that we are seeing a lot of people sharing housing in crowded conditions sometimes, but we have every day, we hear of people who are being displaced from their homes. We hear about young people who want to stay in the communities in which they grew up and they can't find an affordable place to live. So it's really eroding the quality of life in our neighborhoods and our communities, and it's really important that we find ways to turn this around. There are many realtors or developers, people who own many different rentals, but they're in some ways, in some jurisdictions, they're excluded because of the fact that some of the ordinances only apply to units where there are 3 or more housing. In some communities, that means effectively they're not covered by some of these ordinances. So appreciate all the work that you're doing.
You guys too.
I think that, you know, there's so much more to be done.
Thank you. And we'll go across the aisle this way. Robbie?
Just while the mic's being passed, I'll just say, in terms of new resources, at least that is a thing that we are also at a cusp of change on. So the last election, we passed a very large bond to address homelessness, as well as a very large bond to address subsidized housing a lot more broadly. For the first time, starting in 2017, we passed a permanent source of funding for affordable homes, and that will be The first year was for planning grant money and emergency homelessness money, but with the idea of like, let's get the plans in place first, and address the emergency situation. But then for the second year, in perpetuity, each local government in California will have a source of funding to go to affordable homes. And I mean, that is a dramatic change from when I started in this work too. So I'm sorry, I stole your time.
No worries. Yes, Robbie.
That's all right. You know, one thing, how many of us living in cities that don't serve our interest, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of housing policy. Have you seen instances of communities where the housing policy in each community serves perhaps a large number of people there, the rich people, property owners, but then there's those pockets, and everywhere you find these pockets of people, even in the most affluent communities. Have you seen examples of, these pockets coming together and on more of a regional scale to promote housing?
The answer is not satisfying. No. So there was a while in the 90s, there was this big turn in the academic literature on planning and urban politics that thought that regional government was going to be the solution to all the world's ills. And it turns out that the people who have power in the system that create segregation and suburbanization dominated all the regional housing, all the regional governments that got created and then recreated the same inequalities. So there's one example where that didn't happen, and that's the Minneapolis-St. Paul region. And nobody knows why they're so weird. And there's been a lot of work trying to figure out why they're so weird. And now they've upzoned the entire city of Minneapolis so that the entire city, they've gotten rid of single-family zoning for the entire city of Minneapolis. They have a triplex zoning mandatory minimum now, and we'll see what happens. But again, it's not that we can't learn very much from Minneapolis because they're weird. I wish we could. I mean, but there has been attempts to figure this out. I will say that, there is variation across the United States in the degree of integration and segregation that we have. And California is a much more racially and economically integrated state than Alabama is. And so, it's not super helpful, I think, in my opinion, to compare ourselves to Alabama, but rather to compare ourselves within California, who is doing a better or worse job at maintaining integrated communities.
Right. Thank you. There's a hand up. Woman. Yes, ma'am.
It just dawned on me to tap into your wisdom. And my name is Sharika Gregory. But in reference to Marin City being unincorporated, there was a recent investigation which found the school going against anti-discriminatory laws through the Attorney General. So if you have a situation like that existing, is there a way to link it, to fuse it? To because you have been found guilty of creating a school based on segregation, that the surrounding community is automatically going to be entitled to, or certain things have to manifest as a result of that?
So historically speaking, state law and as well as federal law that deals with inequality in the school system and segregation in the school system has been kept separate from the policies that generate the segregation for local jurisdictions. So there has been a lot of movement at the state level in terms of redistributing income in order to equalize funding for schools, say, for instance. And of course, Brown v. Board of Education mandates integration, desegregation in schools. But that same type of policy or decision at the state level or national level has not been applied to city zoning in the same way. And so I think that it's a really exciting idea to sort of think about linking the systems of inequality that perpetuate each other. But to date, we haven't seen a lot of movement on that front. But it seems like an opportunity that's right.
Yeah, and I would just echo that I mean, I think a lot of these are legal questions we haven't tried.
Right.
And that like the law actually kind of points in the direction that you're talking about, to that being illegal, to that being something that must be driven to change. And I think it gets to like, we kind of just have to hire a bunch of lawyers and get people trying some of this stuff. And you know, I don't think it's all like starting from the place of, okay, the Attorney General is gonna sue you. It's an approach of progressiveness and saying, hey, like, we think what you're doing is breaking the law, and we think these are some things you should be doing to change. And if there is still resistance to that change, you know, carrying it forward. But we're gonna, until we try some of these cases, that legal precedent isn't set, and we don't know exactly where the bright lines are here.
So one of the things we know now is that segregation in schools is worse today than it was in 1965. And the reason for that is because of the type of land use regulations that we've been talking about. Because suburbs have created exclusivity, they have also created homogeneous school districts. And so it seems very plausible that somebody at some point could bring a suit that says that the lack of integration in schools has been linked to these land use policies and should be subject to the same types of constitutional violations that school segregation has been subject to. But again, as Megan has suggested, we haven't gone there yet. And I could talk a lot about this.
I don't want to take up too much time, but because of the uniqueness of this, like even for you all on this panel, this is an opportunity for you to really stretch yourselves.
Yeah.
Because in actuality, there's another school that's 3 minutes from Bayside MLK called Willow Creek. They don't have enough kids to feed 2 schools.
Right.
Yeah.
So if they were to close down Bayside MLK, where they have this investigation that is ensuing, you know, the funds that are there to keep that school in existence maybe could be then dispersed to the community members and so on and so forth. Yeah. Also, another question is, what are some mandates that people can bring to Michael's development to try to protect and preserve Marin City in a sense? Like, you know, you need to have so many units, you know, are you going to guarantee, like, what are some things that can be brought forth to, again, address the concerns of the community in this process?
I don't know the specifics of the case, but I would say things like no net loss law come up for me, or like just from the bit that you've shared about it, I would say, you know, no net loss and some exploration there would make sense, but there could be a lot more going on there that I'm not aware of.
Okay, we'll take a few more questions, and then we'll wind down, Liesl, and then we'll go to Karen, and then we'll go to Dave. Liesl? Yeah, the microphone's coming to you. Oh, Dawn? She had her hand up first.
What a good facilitator, you guys. Can you just like, yeah, thanks, Cesar. It's hard to keep track.
Okay, so I just have this question based on experience with Victory Village. Would RCD ever consider building in Marin again after that experience? And why or why not?
What a good question.
Great question. Well, I think we would be looking at the funding question that the gentleman over here asked about. There's not much public subsidy available in Marin, so it does make it harder to compete for the state major funding source, the low-income housing tax credits. And that was a pretty long and harrowing experience, so that definitely is not a good business model for us. We're a nonprofit, but we had to pay our salary for 6 years before we ever got paid to do it. So that said, I think that's not that we would never do it. There are, you know, the calculation for what the local approval process would be going forward, you know, because of the new state laws, it actually might be much more straightforward. Marin Community Foundation, I have to say, really came in as sort of like instead of the public funding in Victory Village. That was the only way that Victory Village worked. So I'd be talking to my colleague Alan, my funder. But it is yeah, it does seem like it wasn't so much that there was opposition to affordable housing in Marin that we experienced, or in Fairfax. It was more like opposition to anything new whatsoever of any sort.
So when you're saying the source of funding, you're saying that we don't have a local housing bond type of thing that would provide that funding?
Correct. Yeah. So well, the county funding that comes from the housing funding that is allocated to different counties, it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy because Marin is, high resource area. There's not much housing funding allocated to Marin, so therefore Marin can't do much to create new affordable housing for low-income people. It's a little bit self-fulfilling prophecy. Or self-perpetuating, and then many other jurisdictions have chosen to issue a bond or tax themselves to invest in new housing resources. San Francisco certainly does it every few years. Alameda County,
a lot of land donation, I would say, too, from other communities.
Yeah, and the East Bay, South Bay, the Silicon Valley are doing it. So. That if that would be something that Marin would consider, that would help.
And I think one of the things we're trying to change when I said like we're looking inward to how do we contribute to this is some of it is that self-fulfilling prophecy is so one of the ways you're judged when you're affordable development seeking funds from the low-income housing tax credit program is how much local match is there? So the idea being, oh, this is a good project because the city says, I'm willing to put some money in, this is a really good project, that helps the state say, hey, this is a really good project. Somebody else was willing to be first money in, so we should feel good putting the next money in. Well, that doesn't work in recalcitrant cities. Like if you don't want housing, the attraction of state funds is not an incentive. And so we've been looking at how do we change that dynamic, at least in high resource areas, to not weight that so, like basically to kind of counteract the weight of that by saying, like extra points for building in high resource areas and higher loan limits basically for building in higher resource areas. Is that equation enough? I don't know.
And the other factor that could help tilt, us toward being more open or interested is also some of the infrastructure constraints. Mm-hmm. And because that's another area where it can be a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy of, oh, well, our sewer system, and this isn't just in Marin, our sewer system isn't meant for that, additional homes. Well, our stormwater system isn't meant for additional homes. Well, our, this and that. And as somebody pointed out at a workshop I went to that Megan was at in this spring, that part of the housing element process needs to, all those other departments that maintain the sewers and maintain the stormwater system, these other infrastructure pieces, the rezoning that happens needs to be supported by all those other components so that towns and counties can't just say, well, we're maxed out on water. There can be no more humans that move to our county, end of story. Well, maybe there needs to be a solution to the water distribution system so that isn't the reason that no new housing happens in a particular location.
Great. Few more comments, questions. We'll go to Dave, and I'll conclude this event.
Thank you. I want to follow up with Marin City a little bit because my understanding is that 686 applies to all public jurisdictions, including housing authorities. Mm-hmm. And my familiarity with the process of looking at redeveloping Golden Gate Village is currently following transferring Golden Gate Village from a HUD platform to a RAD platform, which would require a joint venture agreement with a private developer who would in effect use the development of market rate housing to refurbish a rather unfortunately aging and almost inhabitable public housing in the form of Golden Gate Village. It seems to me that rather than enriching the community, the result of this will be displacement and gentrification under the guise of redevelopment and transferring resources to an underserved community. Have you thought much about how that line can be drawn between actually establishing a richer community within a framework of the protected classes versus turning it into a different kind of community that will have suffered displacement and gentrification?
I don't think I have fully thought about that line. I think there's a lot of exploring to do, and I think that there's good and bad to how gray fair housing is. I think there's times in which it has been used in some places, in fact, as a NIMBY tool, right? Like, oh, we can't put more affordable housing here because we'd be further concentrating poverty because, look, there's a broken window over there, And so I do think we want to be using the gray in a way that promotes inclusivity, promotes additional total homes, total homes without displacement and loss of affordable homes. But I think more than that, I will just say you're right that AB 686 certainly applies to all public entities, but I can't. I think the rest of it is to be explored. Is my take on it.
And I am not speaking from any position of knowledge about the particulars of the Golden Gate Village, but I am generally familiar with the HUD kind of template of transforming public housing with the rental assistance RAD program. And San Francisco basically did it with, I believe, their whole public housing portfolio amongst a handful of nonprofit affordable housing development partners. So I think that is an interesting, set of case studies to look at to see if there's any of those locations where it was done in a way that did not result in displacement. In non-RAD situations, when I've been involved with a renovation of an existing community, it definitely involves temporary relocation or, and then with the goal of bringing people back into their apartments or, another apartment within the same community. In some locations, it can also be done where it becomes actually additional apartments or homes are built within on campus, on the site. And so the new homes, the new apartment kind of building can be built first so that there's not actually a displacement off-site, but you might move into get the new homes built. Existing residents would move into the new apartments while their previous apartments are getting renovated, and then new residents, either they move back or the new residents move into the renovated home. So I would hope that there is a way of approaching it that doesn't result in displacement. But again, I'm not speaking from knowledge about the particulars.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if you weren't here in the beginning, I'm Chandra Alexander with Community Action Marin, and I want to have this opportunity to thank all of our panelists, Megan and Jessica and Alicia. Thank you. thank all of you, of course, for coming. But before we go, I wanted to see if any of you had any closing thoughts or remarks.
Just to thank you.
Thank you for the invitation to discuss this.
Oh, yeah.
Go Warrior, yes, indeed. So my last reminder to you, if you are not already on the Marin Housing Solutions email list, please grab a card from the back table. Make sure you take some of the other literature here. Again, thank you to all of our supporters today, and thank you again to you for coming to be with us on a wonderful Sunday. And note the Marin Housing Solutions website will have the video from this event, and you can stay in touch for further updates and news about legislation in California. And federally, if there are any changes, please make sure to come back and come back soon, and keep yourself informed. Thank you all.
Great to hear you.